Welcome to our first video in our learning module. In this module, you'll be exploring introductory terms and concepts that are related to learning. Overall, in this module, by the end, you should be able to answer the question, how does learning affect how we behave, how we think, and who we become? Some of the big questions that we'll be answering in this module include, how do we learn new skills? And are certain skills pre-programmed into us at birth? And do we always know that we are learning when it happens? In this specific video module, you're going to first be given a brief history of the study of learning. And then we're going to be looking at what learning is, and we're going to be exploring what instincts and reflexes are. And then we're going to be looking at the concept of associative learning, and then we're going to be defining behavior. Behaviorism is also known as behavioral psychology, and this is a theory of learning that's based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through learning. What do you think? Do you think that all of your behaviors occur through learning, or do you think that there are other factors that contribute to how you behave and what you do and how you interact with other people? Conditioning happens through the interaction with the environment, and behaviorists think that our responses to environmental stimuli shape our actions. So based on this way of thinking, behavior can be studied in a systematic and observable manner, regardless of our internal and mental states. So based on this behavior, only observable behavior should be considered. Things like our thinking, our emotions, and moods, they are far too subjective. What do you think? Do you think that those things are far too subjective and can have a negative effect on our ability to understand why people do what they do? Or do you think that our thinking and our feelings and our moods play such an important role that we can't ignore them? Well, strict behaviorists believe that any person can potentially be trained to perform any task, regardless of their genetic background, their personality traits, and their internal thoughts. And of course, this is within the limits of a person's physical capabilities. But behaviorists believe that it only requires the right conditioning. In other words, the right learning. What do you think? Do you think that this is true? Or do you think that our genetics play an important role? Do you think, for example, that personality plays an important role? As you reflect on this, think about what you learned in the module in biopsychology and how genetics affect our behavior. Think about the role of the brain. Think about your own personal beliefs, what you came into this class thinking as you thought about the factors that affect who you are today. Some very well-known theorists who we can think about, or we should think about when we think about behaviorism, include Ivan Pavlov. And if you look at this image, you'll see the one that's on the lower right-hand corner. That's Ivan Pavlov, and we'll be looking at his theory of classical conditioning. If you look at the image in the upper right-hand corner, this is B.F. Skinner. We'll be talking about B.F. Skinner and how he studied the role of learning in affecting behavior and what he found. We'll also be looking at Watson, and Watson's image is on the lower left-hand corner. So behaviorism was formally established in 1913 by the publication of John Watson, and his classic paper was called Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, and it could probably best be summed up by his own quote. And so he said this, and I wonder what you think, if you agree with this. He said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So simply put, strict behaviorists like Watson and Skinner, they believe that all behaviors are the result of experience, that any person, regardless of their background, can be trained to act in a particular way given the right conditioning or learning. So between about 1920 through the mid-1950s, behaviorism grew to become a very dominant school of thought in psychology. And you learned about this in the first module as you explored the history of psychology. Some think that the popularity of behavioral psychology came about out of the desire to think about or to establish psychology as an objective and measurable science. Today, we see the influence of behaviorism all around us. Behavior analysis is the study of altering the environment to increase or decrease the likelihood of different behaviors. As humans, we pride ourselves on our ability to learn. However, it's not just humans that learn. It's all animals across the animal kingdom and insects as well. When we think about learning, learning is important as it enables us to survive. It allows us to adapt to our environment. It allows us to make choices that are based on consequences and that are based upon what we've observed other people doing as we try to be our own unique best. So when we think about learning, there are different theories of learning that are aligned with different approaches to how we think about human behavior. We have behavioral approaches. We have cognitive approaches. We have social approaches, just to name a few. Now, you'll notice in this image, these are loggerhead sea turtle hatchlings that are born knowing how to find the ocean and how to swim. Humans are not born with such complex abilities, but we are born with some reflexive responses. And then eventually those reflexive responses are taken over by learning as we begin to experience our environment. So think about, for example, a baby who, if you were to hold that baby up when they're, just very, very young, and you hold them up in the air, you'll notice that their feet might move as though they're trying to walk. And when babies are in water, they'll make movements of their arms as though they're trying to swim. When babies are being held by their mother and against their mother's breast, they make a sucking movement. They move towards the mother as well. All of these are instinctive and reflexive behaviors that we have. We're biologically wired to engage in these behaviors. So this is different from learning. As we have more experiences, our brain then relies less on these automatic responses and then adapts to the environment. So let's take a look at how we would define or describe learning. I think it's important for us to note that learning overall, regardless of the approach that we take, can be considered to be a relatively permanent change in behavior potential that occurs as a result of experience. So whether we're talking about behaviorism, social perspective, whether we're talking about cognitive perspective, if we're talking about humanism or the humanistic perspective, or any of the other perspectives, what we're really looking at is that relatively permanent change in behavior. And it occurs as a result of experience. So we're going to be looking at some major theories or approaches to thinking about learning as we review this chapter. One term that you'll come across in your textbook is that of unlearned behaviors. Often when we think of unlearned, we think it means that something was learned and then we unlearned it, like you did something and then you undid that. Well, in the case of learning theory in psychology, unlearned means it was never learned, that it's natural and it's just a biological, natural response to a stimulus. So we have some important concepts here. We have instincts and reflexes. Instincts and reflexes are innate behaviors that an organism is born with, and they help organisms adapt to the environment. Reflexes specifically are motor neural reactions to a specific stimulus. They're more simple than instincts. They involve the activity of specific body parts. So as I gave as an example a moment ago, we have a sucking reflex. We also have other behaviors that are reflexive. For example, if you were to take the bottom of a baby's foot and you were to touch the bottom of it with your finger, you'll see that that baby's feet will fan out. I also mentioned the swimming movement, that babies will do that, and the walking movement. Those are just a few. We'll be exploring those later when we look at developmental psychology in the next unit. But these are very basic, simple behaviors that we engage in. And then we have what are called instincts, and these are behaviors triggered by a broader range of events. And so they involve the organism as a whole. So think about, for example, birds. birds migrate to different parts of, of the United States during different seasons. So as the weather gets cold in the north, they migrate to the south. This is a very complex activity. The animal is not just simply reacting in response and has just one area, one area of the brain, or of the brain involved. But what happens is we see here that there is complex activity in the brain that is resulting in this complex behavior. There are other ones as well. There is a very famous researcher, his name was Konrad Lorenz, and what he noticed is that little ducklings, when they would hatch from their eggs, that they would begin during a period soon after their birth, they would begin to follow the first moving object. And so normally what's around the baby bird is its mother, and so it would follow the mother. But Konrad Lorenz found that if he was around during a certain period soon after the baby bird had hatched, that the baby bird would follow him. And it was imprinting, in other words, on Konrad Lorenz, as though Konrad Lorenz was its mother. He also found that if he took a ball, like a red ball, and he put that around that baby bird around that certain period of time, soon after the baby was born, if he moved that red ball in front of that baby bird, it would begin to follow that bird as it would if the bird was its mother. So this is a much more complex behavior. So we have reflexes that are simple, and they involve specific body parts, and they involve primitive centers of the central nervous system. And then we have instincts that are more complex and that involve higher brain centers. As I mentioned a moment ago, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience. And we use the phrase relatively permanent because just because you've learned something doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to always be present and always be present in your mind and affect your behaviors. And we might forget what we've learned. And I think when we think about learning, we need to think about it as not only a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that occurs from experience, but we want to think about it as a relatively permanent change in behavior potentiality. That's probably an important term we could put in here, because potential means you may engage in what you've learned or you may not. Just because we've learned something, that doesn't mean that we are going to actually do that thing. So we might put the phrase potentiality in here if we wanted to expand our thinking about this phrase. So it involves acquiring skills and knowledge through experience, and it also involves conscious and unconscious processes, which you learned about in earlier chapters. What we're going to be looking at is something called associative learning, and this is when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that occur together in the environment. And there are many approaches to learning that we'll be looking at, and they are that are part of behaviorism. We're going to be looking at classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and in particular, here we see associative learning. In classical conditioning, you'll see how we make associations between something in the environment and something that naturally causes a response. And so we make these associations. And then here with operant conditioning, we begin to learn that certain behaviors result in certain consequences. So there's an association. So here we have in this image, a response for this dog is associated with a consequence. The dog has learned that certain behaviors result in receiving a treat. So the dog has made this association. As we think about behavior, we need to think about it through the behaviorist lens, and that's a focus in this chapter, behaviorism, and the role of the environment in shaping our behavior. So first, behavior is the activity of living organisms, animals and people, and it always happens for a reason. So for example, if we ask ourselves, why is someone doing something, we might want to first ask, what are they getting out of this? So for example, is the individual behaving in a certain way to get something that they like or to be able to participate in something that they enjoy? So here's an example. A child wants candy at the checkout line. The child says, I want some candy, and the parent says no. And then the child cries and they whine about wanting more candy. the parent lets the child get candy. So the child learns that crying and whining will get them more candy. Or here's another example. A child wants to use a toy that they like. And let's say that the teacher is holding onto the toy. And so the child grabs the toy towards themselves, or perhaps they cry, and then the teacher gives the child the toy. So the child learns that grabbing the toy, with or without crying, or perhaps even speaking, that this is going to get them the toy. So the child has learned that there is some positive consequence for their behavior. Sometimes these positive consequences may not be actually tangible. They may not be coming from someone else. They might be automatic. So let's say, for example, that someone does something because it feels good to them. And so perhaps just sensory wise, they like the feeling. So here's an example. Maybe a child is crying because they have an earache. So the crying isn't due to a factor that's outside of the child's body. It's due to an experience of the child having that earache. And so perhaps when the child is crying, the child is just responding to that discomfort. So it's just simply a response to that uncomfortable behavior. Now, they might also receive some reinforcement for that. It may be that when they cry, their mother, their father, their caregiver then become responsive or more attentive. And then here's another one. Let's imagine that a child is scratching their skin because they have a bug bite. Maybe they were bitten by a mosquito, and so the scratching of the skin becomes reinforcing because it's getting rid of those uncomfortable behaviors. So it's maintaining that behavior. Another example, sometimes people do things because they might be getting some form of attention. So let's say that we'll use a child example again, that the child is focused on getting attention from parents, teachers, maybe siblings, peers, or other people around them. And this is very natural for children to do this. And so maybe a child is whining or behaving in a particular way that the parent isn't wanting, but they're doing this until they get the parent's attention. So the child's learning that whining will get the attention. And what we'll be looking at is what could a parent do instead? So think to yourself, what could a parent do instead so that the child learns that there are other ways to get the parent's attention? So is really the best idea here, and we'll be exploring this, to punish the whining? Probably not. Probably what we want to do instead is we want to provide reinforcement for those behaviors we want to see. So for example, when the child isn't whining and crying, perhaps we want to be more attentive to the child to recognize their needs and provide them with that attention or that comfort that they want so that they're not led to that point of whining or crying. Another example, let's imagine that a teacher is talking with another adult, maybe a parent or someone else who works at the school, and the child throws an item across the room in the classroom. And maybe the teacher looks at the child and says to them that they need to clean up the toy. So that the teacher is beginning to interact with the child again. And so the child learns that throwing gets the attention of the teacher. So what is it that the child's wanting? The child's been really is wanting the attention, which is very natural. Children want attention. It's biologically natural for children to want attention. Children who, in human history, children who wanted attention and sought that out would be the ones who would most likely survive and then reproduce and pass on their genes. So it makes perfect sense. And so we need to think instead, what do we want the child to do to get attention? Do we want to provide alternative ways for them to get attention? Have we been providing the child with the attention that they really need? And if we haven't, then maybe by doing that, we can reduce the chance that they're going to be throwing a toy to get our attention. And here's another one. Sometimes people will do things to get out of doing something or to avoid doing something that they don't want to do. So I'll use an example of a child again. Let's imagine that a child puts their head down on the desk when they're presented with academic work. For any of you who have children, maybe when you're doing homework with your kids, or especially with online learning, you might find that it can be difficult to get them to do their schoolwork. And so the child is putting their head down on the desk and they're not wanting to do it. So the child is not expected to finish the academic work, let's imagine, because they put their head down on the desk. They say things like, I'm tired, I'm hungry. Now, they may very well legitimately be tired and hungry. So you need to think about those things before asking a child to do homework. You need to make sure that they've had adequate sleep and that you fed them, so that those aren't real reasons that they would be putting their head down. And of course, not only because of that, but you want to make sure you're meeting that child's physiological needs first and foremost. And that's going to lead to the healthiest behavior and the best development for the child. But the child here is learning that putting their head down on the desk will get them out of doing that non-preferred task of doing their schoolwork. So these are some of the reasons that people engage in behaviors. Again, they might do things to get attention. So there's nothing really tangible that they can put in their hand that they're getting. It's just attention. Sometimes people will do things because they're able to engage in enjoyable activity, or maybe they get something from someone for what they're doing. Sometimes we do things because it automatically is reinforcing. And then other times we might do things because it allows us to escape what we don't want to do. And so when we look at behavior, we need to ask ourselves, what is the underlying cause of the behavior? There's always a reason from a behavioral perspective for why someone is doing what they're doing. And if we can get to that reason, then we can address how we can change that behavior if it's something that's not desirable, or how we might want to continue or maintain that behavior if it's something that we want to be continued or maintained, especially if we're talking about children. Or we can think about the application of this in many other areas, and we'll be looking at that in this module. It's important for us to remember too that behavior, if we're thinking about this from a behavioral perspective, is not good or bad behavior. It is simply perhaps desired. It's something that we want to see more of, or it's something that we want to see less of. And we want to keep the child or the adult separate from the behavior. None of us are defined by our behaviors. We each, according to the behavioral perspective, we can change our behaviors. They are not core to who we are. And so we can change our behaviors, and also others can help us to change our behaviors as well, or to continue to maintain those behaviors that are desired. I'd like to add a caveat too, that what we're talking about when I say behavior is not good or bad, I'm not talking about immoral behavior, unethical behavior, or an adult intentionally inflicting harm on another person. Clearly, those are bad behaviors. I'm talking about everyday behaviors, things that may or may not be adaptive to us as people in our everyday lives, and adaptive in the long run. So it might work for us in the short run, but are they really going to help us to reach our potential, to have healthy relationships, to be our best? And remember, behaviorists focus on behavior because it is observable, it's measurable, and it does not occur in isolation. And so we can change behavior by observing when it is happening, and then we can observe the environmental variables or factors that were present before and after, so that we can identify those things that may be contributing to the behavior. What is it that's eliciting the behavior? What is it that was present before the behavior happened? And then what was it that was present afterwards? What did the person or animal, for example, get out of that behavior? Or what was it that was decreasing the behavior? What led to a decline in it? And so behavior, from this point of view, does not ever occur in isolation. If we want to change behavior, we have to clearly define what the behavior is. And I want to ask you, look at these items here. Why might we say that these are not clear behavioral definitions? What limitations might we have if we just use these descriptions of behavior? Are we able to actually change the behavior if we have these vague definitions? Is being good or bad a clear definition? Nice, mean, really, really good or bad? Being naughty, flopping, upset, angry, doing any kind of, doing a behavior. We need to be specific. We have to be very clear about what behavior it is that we're observing. Then we can understand what it is that might be leading to the behavior, because then when we know what behavior we're looking for, we know when we need to examine prior to that behavior and after that behavior. If it's not clear, we don't know what to look for. We don't know when to focus on the environment. So here's an example. Instead of Johnny keeps getting mad when he doesn't get his own way. That's pretty vague. What do we mean by mad? What do we mean by getting his own way? So we might instead say, Johnny screamed for about 2 minutes at a time, 5 times this week when I told him to clean up his toys. So if any of you have children, maybe you work with children, and they're engaging in behaviors that aren't very, they seem to have a negative effect on you and your family, or maybe in your classroom, being really vague and saying getting mad or not getting one's way, that's not going to help you to identify what it is that is leading to the behavior and what might be reinforcing, for example, the behavior in this instance. It's not going to help you later to measure whether or not the changes you've made have resulted in changes in behavior. So we have to know exactly what we're talking about. Here's another example. Tanya gets agitated when her brother is around. Well, what do we mean by agitated? And what do we mean by brother is around? What is the brother doing? So here's a better way, or a more clear way, to define what's happening. Tanya's brother attempted to share her toys 4 times during yesterday's session, and each time she threw her dolls and kicked the floor. So we want to ask her, this gives us a lot more information. What is she getting from throwing dolls and kicking the floor? Why is she doing that? Has this been reinforced in the past? Are we reinforcing this now? Are we going to be able to, if we have an intervention, see a reduction? Maybe if we change what's happening in the environment and then we measure the frequency, we're going to find that next week she's going to do this 3 times, or maybe 2 times, or not at all. But if all we said is agitated, we might not see any change, because maybe Tanya's going to get agitated about something else. And so we need to be very clear if we want to understand behavior and have any effect on behavior change. Here's another example. So instead of Kevin has been really sick this week, maybe we could be more specific by saying during Mondays and Wednesdays afternoon homework, Kevin continued to jump on the sofa and climb under the table while we were doing math homework. So what we're doing here is we're identifying 2 specific days. So we need to ask ourselves, if we're going to understand behavior, is it occurring at a particular time of day, at a particular day? And what exactly is Kevin doing? When we say silly, that's very vague. So here we have jumping on the sofa and climbing under the table. So we're understanding exactly what that means. And then we see it's during math homework. Is he doing it during other homework? So doing this can allow us to understand what might be contributing to the behavior prior to that behavior happening, and what's happening after that behavior that might be maintaining it. So we want to be very clear. So I would ask yourself, think about someone that you know, perhaps a child. Maybe you know a child who's engaging in some behaviors that seem to have a negative effect on maybe the family life at dinner. Or it might be that maybe you know a child who has a difficult time getting, doing their homework. Or maybe you volunteer at a Sunday school and you have a child who during a certain period of time is very distracted and wants to play with certain toys. Or maybe you know an adult who during certain times of the evening is behaving in a certain way. And so think about a behavior that you would like to change, that you see in someone else or in yourself. And then identify exactly what is that behavior, not just it's silly, they're playing with, or they're distracted. What exactly are they doing if they're silly? What exactly are they playing with? What do we mean by distracted? When is this happening? What days? What times? What's happening before this happens? What's happening after? And if we start to record these events, we would then be able to notice what it is that may be contributing to the behavior and what it is that might be maintaining that behavior. So think about applying these principles or these basic ideas to your own life or to someone that you know. So let's do this one more time. Is this behavior or is it not behavior? Coloring. Is that behavior? Yes. Daydreaming. Well, that's kind of vague because we may think that when someone's sitting and kind of staring into space that they're daydreaming. But we can't make assumptions based on what we see a person doing. We can't make assumptions about what's going on in their mind. Perhaps someone thinks that when a child is kind of staring off into space during school that they're daydreaming, but maybe they're not. Maybe instead they're worrying. They're worried about their parents. They're worried about where are they going to get their next meal. So we want to be specific about what we're seeing. Instead, we might say that Kevin at 11 o'clock each day when we begin our math, Kevin will put his arm on the desk and he will put his head on his hand and he will for 10 minutes or for 8 to 10 minutes, we want to, be somewhat specific here, will not look at his homework, but instead will look at the clock or instead will look at this particular thing that's on the wall. Or so we want to be specific. So daydreaming is not specific. We're assuming that that's what's happening. Being in control, is that a behavior? Well, it kind of, if someone appears to be doing what they want to be doing, we might think they're in control, but are we inferring? Can we measure that through observation, or does it require someone to report to us what they're feeling? If we can't measure it through observation, then we can't say that it's a observable behavior. It's not something we can really measure. So this is probably not going to fall in line with behavior. How about writing the answer to an equation? Now, we can definitely see that. We can definitely measure it. We're not inferring. How about not listening? The only way we could say that someone is not listening is if we were to say that they put earplugs in their ears and we know that those earplugs do not permit them to actually hear what someone's saying. So we might want to be more clear and we might want to say that, I'll use Kevin again, Kevin is not following the directions that are given by his teacher. Or when Kevin is asked to pick up his toys, he will not. He refuses. He says no, and then he sits on the floor and he puts his head between his knees. So we're being very specific. We can't say not listening. We can't assume that if someone is not doing something that they're not listening. They probably are listening. They're probably hearing anyways. Maybe they seem to be listening. Maybe they look at you a little bit. They don't look at you. We can't infer though. So we have to know that what we are seeing and observing, we have to know that the behavior is something that we can say is actually happening. We can't say that with listening. Knowing the answer. Well, if someone's writing the answer and it's correct, that's an observable, measurable behavior. Sometimes children will know the answer, but they will not say it. So we would not say that Kevin did not appear to know the answer. Kevin may know the answer, but he may just not want to tell you. So we instead would say Kevin would not provide the answer in writing. Kevin would not share the answer in class in front of his classmates. So by doing that, we understand more of what's taking place. For example, is it something about writing? Is it something about getting up in front of his class? What was happening during that time when we asked him to write or to share his answer? Humming. Here's another one. Humming is definitely observable, right? We can measure it. This is not something that someone is doing inside of their mind. I mean, perhaps someone could, I guess, but we really can measure this. So we could measure it by listening, you as the observer, or we could have a recorder that's recording that event. So some sort of video recording or tape recording. But this allows us to, we can observe this. This is something that is measurable. We're not inferring from it. Okay, so I hope that this helps you to understand the difference between behavior and non-behavior. And if we want to change behavior or increase behavior or maintain behavior, we need to know exactly what we're talking about. If all we are doing is being fairly vague and inferring, we're not going to be able to, using behavioral principles, analyzing the environment, have much of an impact on behavior. And we're certainly not going to know if what we've done to try and change the behavior has worked, because we don't even know after the fact what exactly to measure, because we haven't been able to clearly define it. So let's check your learning. Which of the following describes an instinct? Is it a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that happens from experience? Is it behaviors triggered by a broader range of events? Is it when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that happen together in the environment? Or is it a motor or neural reaction to a specific stimulus? Which one do you think it is? If you're not sure, go back in your notes or rewind this video and go back and take a look at our description of an instinct. If you selected that an instinct is a behavior that's triggered by a broader range of events, you're correct. So A, a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that happens from experience, this is learning, okay? And then C, when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that happen together in the environment, this is associative learning that you learned about. And then D, motor or neural reactions to a specific stimulus, this would be a reflex. So I would encourage you, if you weren't sure about this or you're not sure about any of these descriptions and you don't remember what they describe, I'd encourage you to go back and look at your notes. Let's do another one. Based on what you've learned so far, which of the following is not true about behavior? It occurs for a reason. It's measurable. It's a focus of behaviorists, or it's rarely affected by factors in the environment. So if you're not sure, go back and take a look at your notes or rewind this video. Otherwise, if you're sure, continue. As you learned, behavior occurs for a reason. It's also measurable, and it's a focus of behaviorists. Now, while not all behavior occurs because of factors in the environment, most of the time, according to what we've learned so far from the behaviorist perspective, it happens because of factors in the environment. Now, there may be times when behavior happens because of things happening within the individual. As I gave the example of a child having an earache and they're crying, or you have a bug bite and you're scratching it, okay? And so that scratching is the behavior. But oftentimes behavior is happening because of something going on in the environment, perhaps before the behavior happened or after the behavior happened. So what have you learned so far in this video? Well, what you've learned is you've learned about some of the history of behaviorism. You've learned about the overall views that behaviorists have and some of their key figures like Watson and Pavlov, who we'll be exploring later on in the next video. You also learned what learning is. You now know how to define it. You know how to recognize it. And you know how to differentiate it from other things like instincts and reflexes. You also learned about associative learning. You learned also about behavior, how we define behavior. How is it different from other things? How can we make sure that if we are studying human behavior, that we are clear in what that behavior is? Are we relying on something we can infer, or is what we're studying something that is measurable and observable? In our next video, we're going to be exploring two major theories. We're going to be looking at classical conditioning And we're also going to be looking at operant conditioning. You may have some familiarity with these concepts. For example, in your first module, you learned about Ivan Pavlov. You learned about how he conditioned a dog to salivate to a bell. So you're going to be learning about the principles behind that, behind classical conditioning. And then you're going to be learning about operant conditioning. You're going to be learning about things like positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment, and then how to use these to change behavior and to understand why behaviors happen.